It is a valedictory keynote by none other than Ashwin Sanghi, author of bestsellers such as The Rosabelle Line, Chanakya's Chant, and The Krishna Key. He's also written a non-fictional title, 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck, and that turned out to be a huge bestseller as well. An MBA from Yale, Sanghi's first book, The Rosabelle Line, was actually rejected by 47 literary agents and publishers. And that was very interesting to read when I got this information. To achieve this kind of success after, a slew of setbacks is truly extraordinary. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome Mr. Ashwin Sanghi as we learn from him how to revisit conventional business wisdom. And let me add just here, how did you persevere despite all of those failures? Put your hands together to welcome Ashwin Sanghi.
So, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for having me over. I'd like to start by talking about my journey as an author and give you a little bit of an idea in terms of how I became a writer. And then, of course, we'll start talking about Chanakya and what Chanakya can possibly offer to us as words of wisdom in the times and ages in which we live. So, when I started out, there was a literary agent who told me, when I asked him, I said, please tell me, how do I go about writing a novel? And he said, well, Mr. Sanghi, there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. But there are 3 rules. So I was a little taken aback. But you know what? I was delighted about the fact that no one knew, which meant that I was pretty much free to do whatever I wanted. My upbringing was an entirely Banya, Marwadi, businessman upbringing. So to that extent, when I was 14, my father would send me to his office, and I would be made to learn how to keep books of accounts, debit credit, the basic debit credit, and making a trial balance and figuring out how to post a ledger. And we had a Munimji out there. He was a Marwadi gentleman who used to wear a topi. And he said to me, because I was very fond of my reading even in those days, and I would always have a book in my hand. And he would say to me, he said, in my world, bookkeeping is more relevant than book reading. So why don't you concentrate on your bookkeeping a little more? And if you must read, then read a balance sheet. So this is pretty much the cultural context in which I grew up. Several years later, I had already become successful and was running businesses. And then a friend of mine, he happened to tell me, he said, Ashwin, you need to figure out whether, this is what you want to do. He said, the problem with winning the rat race is that you're still a rat. So you've won, but you're still a rat. So you have to figure out, do you want to be a rat for the rest of your life? So my grandfather, who was very, very fond of sending me books to read, he would send me 1 book every week, without exception. During his lifetime, I received about 412 books from my grandfather. And this gentleman, he would tell me, he would say, you're a businessman, so you already have money. But Lakshmi without Saraswati is of no use. And only when Lakshmi and Saraswati sit together can one prosper, like Ganesha. Which, ladies and gentlemen, explains my physique. So, I really took it to heart. Now, the point is that I started writing. I got inspired by certain events around me, certain places, and I started applying to publishing houses. I started applying to literary agents. And, there is an old quip in the publishing world which says that your manuscript is good and original, but the part that's good isn't original, and the part that's original isn't too good. And that was pretty much my situation when I was approaching so many people. So somewhere along the way, what I did was I created a chart, a wonderful chart which had some of the greatest names up there. And for example, Harry Potter, the very first book, apparently was rejected 12 times. So I put that up in front of my desk. And then there was Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which was 18 times rejected. And of course, there was Stephen King, the very first thriller that he wrote, Carrie, which was rejected almost 30 times. Chicken Soup for the Soul, no one would believe this, but the fact of the matter is that that book was rejected 33 times. Gone with the Wind, 38 times. And of course, topping the list, Ashwin Sanghi, with 47 rejections. Undisputed leader of the rejection game. So, what ended up happening was, after lots of rejections, I decided eventually to self-publish that book. And that first book was self-published by me. My father had a wonderful Punjabi friend who used to come and enjoy a drink with him once in every while. And he was fond of his Patiala pegs. And so I told him, I said, Uncle, everything is going wrong for me. I am in a situation where 47 people have already said no. So he said, क्या problem है? तुम एक और को apply कर दो, 10 और को apply कर दो. He said, so I told him, I said, there is no one left to apply to. There is no one left on my list. So he turned around and he said, listen, beta, just do one thing. Remember one thing. In life, 99% is about good luck. So I was in a bit of an argumentative mood. So I said, but uncle, what about the remaining 1%? That must be hard work. It must be talent. It must be efficiency. It must be your networking skills. It must be something. And he picked up his glass, which still contained half of the Patiala peg. And he said, oh, that is known as bloody good luck. So, I consider it my bloody good luck to be here in front of all of you. So, that actually set off my writing journey. I ended up self-publishing that first book, The Rosabal Line, in 2007. Eventually, it was picked up by a publisher, Tata Westland, in 2008 and published in India. Chanakya's Chant was published in 2010. The Krishna Key in 2012. And of course, I'm currently writing a couple of books along with James Patterson, who does some wonderful crime thrillers. So we did one last year, and we will end up doing probably another couple of books. And finally, of course, my non-fiction work, 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck, which was inspired by that Patiala peg story. So, as of today, over 1 million books sold. So that's a little far away from the fact that this was a person who was being rejected by all and sundry. So we are still working on trying to get these numbers up. So now let me come to my main topic, revisiting conventional business wisdom with Chanakya. Okay. It is, Warren Buffett was famous for having said rule number 1, never lose money. And rule number 2, never forget rule number 1. And that was Warren Buffett for you. Now, I was thinking to myself that if I was to consider Chanakya, and what would Chanakya say? Well, the fact of the matter is rule number 1 and rule number 2 are very much there in Chanakya's head. But Chanakya would say rule number 3, be virtuous, honest, and upright. And rule number 4, occasionally forget rule number 3. That's pretty much what Chanakya, it sums up Chanakya for you. So, my story actually, my intimacy with the story of Chanakya starts from 1971. And all of you must be wondering what the hell happened in 1971. Well, in 1971, Amar Chitra Katha came out with a comic called Chanakya. And that was my first exposure to this man. I ended up reading that comic probably sometime around 1980. And then by 10 or 11 years later, Doordarshan had just come up with this beautiful TV serial called Chanakya. Surprise, surprise. So that eventually prompted me in 2008 to do my first ever reading of the Arthashastra, a translated version by Shama Sastry. And that eventually inspired me to write Chanakya's chant in 2010. Now, what exactly do we know about Chanakya? Let's look a little bit behind the man. Let's look a little bit about his story. Chanakya, we know, lived somewhere around roughly the 4th century BC, around 300 BC and odd. We know for a fact that he lived in the kingdom of Dhananand, which was part of the Nanda Empire. And Dhananand wasn't too great a king. So apparently, as the story goes, now some of it is myth, some of it is real. But as the story goes, Dhananand invited a bunch of Brahmins to the court for a feast. And while all of them were feasting, including Chanakya, he got angry with Chanakya and asked him to get up and leave. And Chanakya decided to get up and leave. And of course, he vowed to Dhananand that I will make sure that your entire dynasty is finished. I will make sure that you are no longer king. And I will refuse to tie my ponytail till such time as I have actually succeeded in my efforts. So, all the makings of a wonderful Bollywood blockbuster. That's the Chanakya story. We know that after he left, he ended up meeting this young lad called Chandragupta. And he told Chandragupta that come with me, and then they ended up going to Takshila, which was at that time the greatest university of its time, very close to Rawalpindi. And, well, you can in fact see these are the actual ancient ruins of Takshila which still exist. So he took Chandragupta there, and then, of course, put him through training in the ancient Gurukul system. And then eventually they started attacking Dhananand's kingdom. And what happened? Huge amount of disastrous loss. One after the other, the battles were not going Chanakya and Chandragupta's way. And then what happened was that Chandragupta saw an old woman feeding a pot of porridge, a bowl of porridge, to her kid, to her child. And the lady said to her child, she scolded her child. She said, "You've burnt your fingers, and you've burnt your fingers because you put them in the center of the porridge rather than on the edges. If you had simply started from the edges and moved towards the center, you wouldn't have burnt your hands." And that's what struck Chandragupta and Chanakya. And they decided that they would now attack the peripheries of the kingdom rather than attempting to attack the center of the kingdom. And of course, Chandragupta eventually ended up attacking the Nanda Empire also. And if you look, it was about roughly 16 different distinct kingdoms prior to Chandragupta. But by the time that Chandragupta was done, almost the whole of India was part of that Mauryan Empire. So it's a wonderful story. And then, of course, once this entire consolidation had happened, Chanakya then sat down in order to write the Arthashastra. And the Arthashastra, of course, besides the Arthashastra, of course, he wrote the Niti Shastra, which is sometimes known as Chanakya Niti. The Arthashastra is huge. There are 15 books within the Arthashastra. Each, there are 150 chapters in total, each one covering a specific area. A total of 180 topics and 6,000 verses. It's probably a magnum opus of some sort. So, let's now look at Kautilya's Arthashastra. What exactly is it? Well, many people have compared the Arthashastra to Machiavelli. They say that, well, at the end of the day, what Chanakya talks about and what Machiavelli talk about is pretty much the same thing. And in fact, the common refrain is that Chanakya is the Indian Machiavelli. But I want you to just think back for a minute that the dates of Niccolo Machiavelli, roughly around the 15th, 16th century. And on the other hand, you have Chanakya, roughly around 371 BC. So to that extent, I would say probably Machiavelli is the European Chanakya, not the other way around. Okay, so what exactly is the Arthashastra? I want you to think of it as this wonderful consulting report. I'm sure each one of you at some point of time has seen a McKinsey report. So the cover of a McKinsey report would be something like this. Now let's just do one thing. Let's take the date, which is December 2015, and make it 300 BCE. And then let's take these photographs and make them more appropriate to that time. Now, let's change the Global Institute to Takshila University, which is where Chanakya operated from. Let's take the name McKinsey and Company, and let's call it Kautilya and Company. Kautilya, of course, was the other name of Chanakya. And of course, some of you will ask, why company? Well, if you really think about it, in the Arthashastra, Chanakya talks about Brihaspati, Ushanas, Parasar, and various other writers who came before him. So to that extent, he's very clear that my manuscript is a work of several people before me. So therefore, the company. Then let's take the map and just replace it with the Mauryan map. And let's remove this title. And now let's think of a good title for this. A Manual for Effective Governance? Yes, but doesn't really say what we are talking about. Foreign policy, internal security, defense, and the economy. That could be another title for the Arthashastra. National wealth. Boring. Wealth of nations, to Adam Smith, right? I mean, for heaven's sake. Adam Smith almost. So let Adam Smith have it. The science of wealth. Now there we are getting somewhere. So that's precisely what the Arthashastra is. Shastra, meaning science, and Artha, meaning wealth. It's the science of wealth. And which isn't too bad a thing, because if you really go back into Hindu philosophy, there are 4 objectives which we are supposed to live for. On the one hand, there is kama, which is pleasure, desire, love. On the other hand, there's artha, which is wealth, power, material well-being. There's dharma, which is duty, righteousness, law. And finally, there's moksha, self-realization, and salvation. Now, Chanakya does talk about each of these things, but he's very clear. His responsibility is to tell you how to make money. It's about artha and nothing more. So just look at the list of topics that Chanakya eventually gets into in the Arthashastra. It's incredible. In fact, it's a partial list. What is here is a partial list. So he talks about accounting and reporting systems. He talks about audit and control. He talks about consumer protection. He talks about defense and the army and how it should be organized. He talks about foreign policy, intelligence, judicial systems, public and private sector, taxation. I mean, for heaven's sake, we are talking about someone who wrote this almost about 2,300 years ago. So, it was Bill Clinton, the great presidential candidate, who in 1992 said, "It's the economy, stupid." And apparently that line won him the general elections? Well, I would go as far as to say that Chanakya pretty much said the same thing. It's the economy is stupid. Let's look at what Chanakya was saying. The king is advised to be ever active in the management of the economy because the root of wealth is economic activity, and inactivity brings material distress. Without an active policy, both current prosperity and future gains are destroyed. In other words, you need to get your hands dirty and you need to manage the economy. So, can anyone tell me what these names are? Are these places? Are these people? What are they? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Not even one hand? Sorry? Milestones? Okay, that's a great one. I heard a word somewhere at the back. Lovely. Who was that? Thank you so much, sir. It is Madeira. It is alcohol. So, for example, Medaka is actually rice wine, a precursor to what we call rice wine. And if you take, for example, Prasanna, it's a precursor to beer because it's made from barley. Asav and Merea are from jaggery. Again, if you look at rum today, it's made from the same stuff. And finally, there's Madhu, which is grape wine. There is Kapishavayan, which is Afghan wine. It was imported from Afghanistan. Of course, I doubt whether you could import wine from Afghanistan anymore. And there is Harahuraka, which is Arakosia wine. Again, an import. The point I'm trying to make here is, if you read the Arthashastra, you will be stunned to find that there are cocktail recipes inside the Arthashastra. And you will be wondering as to why are there these recipes inside a work of finance. For example, he talks about kinva, which is 1 part rice with 3 parts beans. Medak, which is taking the kinva and converting it into rice wine. And of course, multiple formulas for how to distill, how to ferment, and how to manufacture. Now the question that arises is, why is he doing all of this? Why is Chanakya doing this? Well, as far as Chanakya was concerned, he had no moral compulsion regarding alcohol. What he talked about was really the fact that he would have a monopoly on the manufacture of alcohol. So the state would have a manufacturing monopoly as far as alcohol is concerned. So he talks about the fact that manufacture of liquor must remain a state monopoly. The exception is only alcohol, which is used for medicinal preparations. He then talks about consumption to be done only in state-run drinking halls. May not be bought for consumption elsewhere. Persons of good character allowed to purchase. Now, honestly speaking, difficult to figure out what he means by good character, but nevertheless, that is very much there in the Arthashastra. Certified containers of certain sizes have been specified in the Arthashastra, almost like sort of packaging guidelines. Then he talks about the fact that the drinking halls must have rooms which are equipped with beds and seats. Rooms to be kept pleasant with flowers, water, and perfume. He talks about the fact that if a person is moving around when they are intoxicated, then that is to be prohibited. Chief Controller of Alcoholic Beverages. Now we see the designation. The Chief Controller of Alcoholic Beverages is meant to keep a control over this entire process. The state, to manufacture at specified locations, may take the help of experts in brewing and fermenting. Liquor only to be sold against cash. This will make a lot of people happy. Only to be sold against cash, no credit allowed. Secret agents to keep a watch for those who spend lavishly. What we talk about, source of income. Identify those without known source of income. Agents to keep a watch on strangers. Agents to gather information from female attendants regarding anything revealed when the customer was intoxicated. Making, selling, or buying at an unauthorized location to attract a penalty of 600 panas. Panas was the currency of that time. Drinking hall operators to make note of ornaments, clothes, cash, or valuables of customers. Any loss suffered by the customer is the responsibility of the operator. Operator to make good the loss in addition to a fine. At the end of each day, the chief controller to ascertain the quantity sold, transaction tax collected, revenue collected, countervailing duty. By the way, this is specified in the Arthashastra, countervailing duty, and determine the net balance to be remitted to the treasury. Closing stock is equal to opening stock minus quantity sold plus a 2% sticking allowance. I'll explain to you what it means. Essentially, we've got a situation today in India where several states are talking about prohibition. And what I find is so ironic is the fact that the very state where Chanakya operated, the state of Bihar, where the capital was Pataliputra, that very place is now planning to go dry. So, what Chanakya says is that honestly speaking, I don't need prohibition, I need control. And by having that control, I can also get revenue. He not only does that for alcohol, gambling, for example, he says gambling is prohibited, but it is allowed within the licensed gambling halls. And halls are managed by licensed masters who are responsible for providing undoctored gambling equipment. In other words, the dice should not be loaded. And then there's a 5% tax on all winnings. See where the money making is coming in again. A 5% tax on all winnings. And master can be severely punished for loaded dice or cheating. Now, of course, we must keep in mind that Chanakya's times were different. So, to a certain extent, our yardstick of morality may not apply to Chanakya's times. So, for example, when we talk about all the vices of the world, we talk about alcohol, we talk about gambling. Well, let's talk about the next vice, prostitution. And Chanakya says that it's a state activity. So in other words, all the revenues from prostitution are part of his treasury. And if you are an independent courtesan, known as Roop Jivas, you had to pay 1/6 of your earnings as a tax. So, at the end of the day, it's all about money, honey. And that's really the idea of giving you these 3 examples was to tell you where Chanakya was coming from. But then that's not all what Chanakya is about. I mean, he talks about consumer protection. For example, Manasrava. Manasrava, Srava, by the way, means dead body, Shrav. So, Manasrava means an extra quantity given as a heating allowance for the loss of volume on heating. So, for example, if you were buying ghee and you heated the ghee, then you were going to lose a certain quantity. So, that had to be compensated to the customer who was buying the ghee. Similarly, he talks about tapta vyaji, which means that it's a sticking allowance. In other words, when you're measuring something using a measure, a certain amount of the liquid is likely to stick to the measuring container. So he says that there is an excess amount that needs to be given to the customer in order to compensate for that. Similarly, for example, he talks about the chief controller of state trading. The chief controller's job is primarily to inspect the weights and measures of traders, prevent hoarding, adulteration, overcharging. Then there's a chief controller of state trading, so private trading and state trading. Buffer stocking for crisis. I mean, we could take a lesson from this, right? Buffer stocking for crisis. We keep seeing this happening with all types of commodities. But here, Chanakya actually talks about the fact that what quantity should be maintained in the state godowns so that in the event of any sort of crisis, that food is available. So he even talks of medical malpractice. So for example, he says, physicians undertaking medical treatment without intimating the government the dangerous nature of the disease shall, if the patient dies, be punished with the first financial penalty. So there were different levels of financial penalty. So this is the first level of financial penalty. Then he says, in the death of a patient under treatment, and that is due to the carelessness in the treatment, the physician shall be punished with the middle financial penalty. And growth of disease due to negligence or indifference shall be regarded as assault and will attract criminal penalties. We're talking about a man who lived 2,300 years ago. I'm still fascinated by the fact that this was the level of thinking at that time. Think about this. This is applicable to all of us. In our day-to-day lives, we keep wondering, how do I manage my time? How do I make sure that I'm more efficient, more effective? Well, what Chanakya does is he divides the day into 16 portions. And each of those portions, so we have 24 hours in a day. In Mauryan times, you had 16 hours. Those hours were known as muhurats. That's where we get the name muhurat from. When we take out a muhurat for a wedding, we are actually saying take out the hour. So he takes these 16 slots and he says, well, it starts at sunrise, and then you reach up to noon. Then, of course, there's sunset, and then midnight. So he divides the entire day into these 4 portions. And then, taking these 16 portions of the day, he actually makes out a schedule for the king. That how is the king expected to use his time? So, 90 minutes after sunrise, receive reports on defense, revenue, expenditure. 90 minutes after sunrise. That's going to be one frazzled king starting 90 minutes after sunrise with this. Public audience to hear petitions of people. Personal time, bath, meal, study. 90 minutes before noon, receive revenue, tributes, and allot tasks to your ministers. Write letters and dispatches for the next 90 minutes. Personal time, bath, meal, study. Inspect and review the armed forces. Consult with the chief of defense. Interviews with secret agents. The espionage system of Mauryan times is remarkable. Remarkable. Probably, can compete with the CIA of today. Personal time, again. Then the next 3 hours, sleep, which means roughly about 4.5 hours. Meditate, prepare task list after getting up. Consult with the counselors, religious, household, and personal duties. So, effectively what he's talking about is roughly about 4.5 hours of sleep for the king. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Narendra Modi is doing somewhat like that, right? It's about 4 hours and odd, 4-5 hours. And then, just see the amount of time that he puts for study. There are 3 specified times where he talks about people actually going back and revisiting their material. And then, when you get up, you must spend time in terms of meditation. And of course, the task list. He says the moment you get up, prepare your task list so that you know what you need to do during the day. These are very common things which today we take for granted in management theory, but it was all there in the Arthashastra. Then he goes on to say, if the king is energetic, his subjects will be equally energetic. If he is slack or lazy in performing his duties, his subjects will also be lax and thereby eat into the treasury. Chanakya goes on to say, even a minute of one's life cannot be obtained, even for 1,000,000 gold coins. If it is not used purposefully, what loss is bigger than that? And the funny thing is that if you take most of the great gurus, the business gurus, Henry Ford went on to say, it has been my observation that most people get ahead during the time that others waste. So in effect, what Chanakya was saying 2,300 years ago is coming back in different forms. Governance, what does he say? The king's duties are 3. Raksha, which is protection of the state from external aggression. Palan, which means maintenance of law and order within the state. Yogakshama, safeguarding the welfare of his people. 3, nothing more. That's it. And then he says, when in the court, the king shall never cause his petitioners to wait at the door. Never cause his petitioners to wait at the door. For when a king makes himself inaccessible to his people and entrusts his work to his immediate officers, he may be sure to engender confusion in the business and to cause thereby public disaffection and himself prey to enemies. It's what we call customer feedback these days, right? That be in touch with your customers. It's pretty much that. And all urgent calls he shall hear at once, but never put off. For when postponed, they will prove too hard or impossible to accomplish. Now, in India, we've acquired this reputation of being a scam economy, right? I mean, that one scam after the other keeps on happening. Everyone talks about the fact that he is corrupt, she is corrupt. Well, what does Chanakya do? How does he deal with corruption? Well, it's rather interesting. Chanakya says, just as it is impossible to know when a fish moving in water is drinking it, so it is impossible to find out when government servants in charge of undertakings misappropriate money. Interesting. Very interesting. Now, the question is, that is an observation, but what does Chanakya actually do about it? Well, in India, of course, we have the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, right? Who is supposed to be keeping a watch on everyone. Well, you'll be surprised to know that in Mauryan times, there is a designation which is known as the Chief Controller and Auditor, the CCA. The Chief Controller and Auditor. He's responsible for construction and maintenance of the Records Office. Office to be built facing north or east. Vastu was an important part of that. Separate seats for the accountants. Well-ordered shelves for the account books. Maintain consolidated accounts for each department and total income received from it. For a state manufacturing operation, a stock register showing raw material bought or received, quantities consumed, manufacturing, stock changes due to transaction tax, changes due to different weights and measures. A separate register showing expenditure on labor employed. He goes on. Rules, rules, rules. This is how you will maintain your accounting. Closing day for the accounting year to be the full moon day of the month of Asad. The month of Asad is basically specified as June, July. The accounting year consists of 354 days in Chanakya's world. And those 354 days, you're supposed to maintain the accounts, and then there's separate records for the changeover from the lunar to the solar calendar. So he provides for that. The CCA to appoint inspectors of different grades, inspectors to be selected such that the king has no hesitation in punishing them. CCA responsible for compilation of all fixed rules as well as accounting conventions. On year closing day, all accountants and officers of regions to present themselves with sealed accounts books and with net balance of revenue over expenditure. Sounds like one of our accountants, right? One of our auditors. Officers to be kept separate from one another and not allowed to mingle. Again, sounds like one of our control systems almost. CCA shall have the accounts thoroughly audited, checking daily entries as well as weekly, fortnightly, monthly, blah, blah, blah. CCA to prepare for each department estimated revenue, actual revenue, outstanding revenue. Sounds almost like a budgeting, a full-blown budgeting exercise. CCA to also compile reports on the presentation of accounts by all other officials. Punishments to be prescribed for loss of revenue. So, all of you would be familiar with Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Let's just change that a little bit. In the case of Chanakya, he's prescribed 40 steals. The 40 steals are basically 40 ways in which an officer could actually embezzle funds. And he lists each of these in great detail. For example, accounting for a receipt later than the actual date. accounting for a payment earlier than the actual, allowing a due to remain unpaid, and so on and so forth. In other words, he literally gets into the crux of each and every situation in which money could possibly be made by a corrupt official, going all the way up to number 40. Okay, so in modern times, of course, we have budgeting, and then we have accounting, which leads to an audit process, and which eventually leads to a financial report, which then again feeds back into a budgeting exercise. Pretty much the same thing at Chanakya's time. And this is what I'm trying to tell each one of you, that I had hoped that I would come here and give you something new. But the more and more you go into the Arthashastra, you realize that there's nothing new about it. It's pretty much what we are used to doing. Take, for example, foreign policy. He says every neighboring state must be considered an enemy, and the enemy's enemy is a friend. So, taking this in a practical context, for example, if you take, let's say, China, what Chanakya is saying is that, well, China considers India to be an enemy. Therefore, to that extent, India's enemy, which is Pakistan, becomes China's friend, in effect. And by running that logic further, he's trying to say that, well, if Afghanistan has a problem with Pakistan, then Afghanistan and India are natural allies. So, what does it mean actually in terms of war and peace? Well, in a business sense, what it means is Chanakya saying, like a stone striking an earthen pot, a superior king attains a decisive victory over a weaker one. And if you really think about it in the business world, we don't think of things very differently. So we have, for example, Richard Branson saying, the time to go into a new business is when it's badly run by someone else. So, Chanakya talks about types of kings. So he says, for example, there is an antagonist, the enemy, the friend, the enemy's ally, the friend of an ally, enemy's ally's friend. I mean, by the end of it, he goes into multiple permutations and combinations on kings. And for each of them, he specifies the ideal strategy to work with. Madhyam, even the middle king. So, what does he talk about in terms of strategies to deal with other kings? Well, he says you could make peace treaties, samadhi. You could have vigraha, hostilities, both overt and covert. Asan, staying quiet. Yana, preparing for a war. Samasray, seeking protection. And Dvaiti Bhav, alliance with an enemy. Now, if you really think about it in business terms, what we are talking about is takeovers and collaborations, competition, confidentiality, non-disclosure agreements, business plans, white knights and mergers, and monopolies and cartels. So he's pretty much covered all the strategies in each of these situations within the Arthashastra. I used to love watching Yes Minister, and in Yes Minister, which was a lovely BBC TV series, it used to say that government is about principles. And the principle is never act on principle. And pretty much that's what comes across in the Arthashastra. So, there is a massive espionage system, merchant spies inside forts, saints and ascetics in the suburbs of forts, cultivators and recluses in the country, herdsmen in the boundaries of the country, in forests, forest dwellers. These are all people who are to be stationed in order to collect information. So what Chanakya is talking about is the value of information, and he's also talking about the time value of information. Conflict resolution. What does Chanakya say? Well, I want you to think about a couple of pictures. Sorry, there seems to be some problem. One is he talks about adopting a conciliatory attitude. In other words, or for example, if you, let's say, take the situation with China and Pakistan, lots of rewards, lots of gifts, lots of freebies. So placating with rewards and gifts. And then he talks about sowing dissension among enemies and finally using force. Now, in the case of adopting a conciliatory attitude, what he's talking about is sama. Sama meaning be nice. Dana, which means buy out your enemy. Bhed, sow dissension. Dand, use force. So the sama, of course, could be using praise, leveraging common contacts, connections. It could be saying, oh, I didn't know that you know so-and-so. You know, dana is, of course, relinquish what is owed or continue another gift. Bhed, create mutual suspicions. And, of course, dand, which is open war or secret war. So, in the Arthashastra, we have lots and lots of passages which talk of infrastructure. So, for example, the king shall carry on mining operations and manufacture, exploit timber and elephant forests, offer facilities for cattle breeding and commerce, construct roads for traffic both by land and water, and set up market towns. He shall also construct reservoirs filled with water, either perennial or drawn from some other source. Or he may provide sites, roads, timber, and other necessary things for constructing reservoirs by the private sector. And finally, likewise in the construction of places of pilgrimage. What he is talking about is public sector, facilitation, infrastructure, public-private partnership. We nowadays talk about public-private partnership. It was very much there in the Arthashastra. Today if you look at the average width of a road, it's about 29 feet. So that about roughly 4 lanes, 2 lanes on one side and 2 lanes on the other are available. And then, of course, you have progressively higher and higher widths. In Chanakya's time, he specifies 54 feet wide roads. 54 feet wide roads, which are far more than the 29-foot standard. And those are for royal highways, roads leading to divisional headquarters. He also talks about 27 feet wide roads for the forests and the reservoir embankments. And then, of course, there are progressively lesser roads, which are 13.5, 7.5, 3 3/4. The idea is basically that each use has been correctly specified, has been correctly encapsulated in the width. I just want you to see this. The width of a Roman road at the height of the Roman Empire was about 21.3 feet. And here we have Chanakya talking about 54 feet. So, urban planning. What is he, we are talking about planned cities and smart cities. What does the Arthashastra talk about in terms of urban planning? Well, he says basically that this is the way Chanakya plans the towns. So, for example, he says there should be 4 gates. The highest one, of course, has been cut off. It's the Brahma gate. And the Brahma gate is what is the most sacred part of it. Then he talks about avenues which are linking the gates. Then he talks about subsidiary gates. And then the city center, the royal residence, the chariots, carriages, stables, teachers, priests, water storage, the royal temple, hospitals, treasury, jewelry district, the metalworking district. All of this towards the north. Then the armory, the storehouse, the records and audit office, the district for the traders, vaishyas, the grain merchants and other merchants, state factories, factory officials, bureaucrats, the restaurants, entertainment, and the bars and the courtesans towards the south side. And then finally, he talks about the guilds and the workshops, the Kshatriya district, which is basically an army district, homeware, toiletries, flowers, perfumes, all towards the north, the northeast. The foreign merchants, tailors, textiles, washermen, workers' camps, and the Shudra district. Now, this is entirely specified within the Arthashastra, that this is the way you should plan a city. I'm not saying that that's the right plan, I just wish that we had more of this sort of planning happening. And then, of course, he talks about a moat around the city in order to protect it from invaders. We've been discussing the land bill for so long, but actually the Arthashastra specifies a land use policy where he talks about arable land, forest land, reservoirs, mines, and others. Then the arable land is crown land, private land, and pasture land, which means some of the land belongs to the state and some of it is private. Then we have the forests, which include productive and non-productive, but he specifies what should be done with each. The productive ones should be used for produce and for managing elephants, because elephants are very, very vital as far as battle is concerned. Non-productive, used for ascetics, recreation, wildlife. Reservoirs can be both public sector and private sector. Mines can be crown operated and they can also be private sector, which are leased to private individuals. And finally, other land, which could be used for settlement or waste. So, Chanakya talks about the state. If we look at the definition of a state, the state is a compulsory political organization with a centralized government that maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a certain territory. Now, this is the modern day definition of the state. But what does Chanakya say? He says, well, if you have territory, if you have people, if you have fortified towns and cities, a king, council and ministers, an army, treasury, a bureaucracy, and allies, well, this put together is the state. It's as simple as that. So he says these are the elements of the state. Now, for a minute, just let's take a step back and go back into these components. If I was to look at today's modern business context and read the Arthashastra from the angle of what Chanakya has given in the context of a business, let's look at the king as a CEO, and the council of ministers as a board of directors, the bureaucracy as the management, the people as the customers, the treasury as the capital resources, territory as market share, products and services, team, and bankers, consultants, auditors. Is in effect, you are describing the modern day enterprise. In effect. And if you start looking at what Chanakya prescribes for each of those components, it's very, very applicable even to the modern day business. What does he talk about? Taxes. Just as one plucks fruit from a garden as they ripen, so shall a king have the revenue collected as it becomes due. Just as one does not collect unripe fruits, he shall avoid taking wealth that is not due, because that will make the people angry and it will spoil the very source of revenue. In general, current income, 1/6 of revenue, transferred income. By transferred income, he's meaning estate duty. So in other words, the father dies and the son gets it. Then 1/4 of that goes back to the state. But then there's a huge list. Entertainment tax, agricultural produce, fines and penalties, revenue from the controller of temples and holy places, revenue from the chief controller of betting, outsiders entry tax, octroi is also there, by the way, mining royalties, passport fees. Every citizen had a passport at the time of the Arthashastra. Property tax, treasure trove. I mean, it goes on and on. Honestly speaking, you realize that we are living in much better times, actually, when you look at the list of taxes. So he says that there are 3 possible faults in revenue collection: causing a loss to the treasury by collecting less, or causing pain to the citizens by collecting more, and of course causing loss by not managing expenditure and income. The 8 reasons for a poor revenue collection: ignorance of work, laziness, neglect of work, timidity due to fear, corruption and showing favors, short temper resulting in alienation of citizens, arrogance, greed, prompting false calculation. He also offers lots of tax exemptions. I'm not going to get into each one, but there are several tax exemptions which have been offered by Chanakya in the Arthashastra. But what is most important is, he says, just as elephants are needed to catch elephants, so does one need wealth to capture wealth. And that's pretty much what we talk about in terms of modern day finance, right? We say it's not how much money you make, but how much money you keep and how hard does it work for you. If you take, for example, modern day banking system, it's entirely related to the risk and return function. Normal transactions in Chanakya's time, 15% per annum. Commercial transactions, 60% per annum. Risky travel through forests, 120% per annum. I'm sure there must be bankers here who must be feeling so, they must be salivating right now with these interest rates. 120% per annum. And risky travel by sea, 20% per month or 240% per annum. In effect, what you're talking about is the fact that Chanakya has added on a risk element onto each and every interest slab. And the riskier it is, the more it costs. No one shall charge or cause to be charged a rate higher than the above. What does he talk about human resources? A king can reign only with the help of others. One wheel alone does not move a chariot. And of course, we hear the same thing from Steve Jobs. He says, great things in business are never done by one person. They are always done by a team of people. Chanakya talking about teamwork in 300 BC. A king should appoint advisors as counselors and listen to their advice. Anyone who is appointed as a counselor must have the highest personal qualities. And here we have Buffett saying, it's better to hang out with people better than you. Pick out associates whose behavior is better than you, and you'll be drifting in that direction automatically. He even goes into the details of how you can acquire the best talent. So, for example, he says, there are 4 groups of potential recruits: the angry ones, the timid ones, the greedy ones, and the proud ones. Sorry? On education, yeah, there is, I can't figure out who is asking the question. Yeah, we'll get to it. So he talks about how to justify the anger of a person and use that anger in order to recruit him. How to reinforce the insecurity of a person to get them to quit their jobs. Lure them with offers and massage their ego. How? Think about this, that if we take the highest pay to the median pay, the average ratio, we have been talking about guys like Walmart at about 1,100 times, Starbucks at about 700 times, Microsoft at about 600 times. In the Mauryan kingdom, you had roughly 800 times as the average ratio. Highest to lowest salary, about 800 times. Training and development, the sciences may only be studied and their precepts strictly observed under the authority of specialist teachers. The duty of a student is devotion to his teacher, even at the cost of his own life. And we have, of course, Bill Gates saying everyone needs a coach. It doesn't matter what you're playing, you need a coach. And that's pretty much what Chanakya talks about. Excellence. The one excellent lesson that can be learned from the lion is that whatever one intends doing should be done with wholehearted and enthusiastic effort. And we had the same thing from J.R.D. Tata, who said one should strive for excellence, even perfection in any task. Once you start working on something, don't be afraid of failure. Don't abandon it. People who work sincerely are the happiest. Walt Disney said pretty much the same thing. The difference between winning and losing is most often not quitting. He talks about motivation. For example, speak sweetly to those from whom you expect favors. Where the hunter spots a deer, he attracts it with a sweet song. And we have Sam Walton saying, nothing else can quite substitute for a few well-chosen, well-timed, sincere words of praise. Virtuous persons and fruit-laden trees bow, but fools and dry sticks break because they do not bend. And our own, very own Dhirubhai Ambani said, I am willing to salute anyone for my work. One thing you won't find in me, and that's an ego. So, to sum up, in terms of fiscal prudence, we have a situation where if we look at the government of India, the central government, our total expenditure on salary is about roughly 12 lakh crores. And if we take the total taxes, it's about roughly 80 lakh crores. If I run a simple ratio on this, it's about 151%. Salaries account for 151% of our taxes. On the other hand, the Arthashastra says, in accordance with the requirements of his forts and country, the king should fix 1/4 of the total revenue as salaries. Just imagine what his fiscal budget must have looked like. Perception. Even if a snake is not poisonous, it should pretend to be venomous. That's what Chanakya says. And of course, you have Elon Musk saying pretty much the same thing, right? Brand is just a perception, and perception will match reality over time. We've always heard this, right? Customer is king. And Chanakya also somewhat says that in the happiness of his subjects lies the king's happiness. In their welfare, his welfare. He shall not consider as good only that which pleases him, but treat as beneficial to him whatever pleases his subjects. And of course, the closest we can come to that is probably the Google guys, right? We have a mantra, don't be evil, which is to do the best things we know how for our users, for our customers, for everyone. He even talks about corporate social responsibility, like it is essential for the bound water to have a little flow for its purity. So, it is important to donate a part of the earned wealth for its protection. And we had the same thing by tons and tons of people who were great givers telling us pretty much the same thing. So, I'll end with one wonderful verse from the Arthashastra, which says, there is no austerity equal to a balanced mind, and there is no happiness equal to contentment. And Alfred Nobel said pretty much the same thing. Contentment is the only real wealth. So, let me end with a final quote from Yes Minister, and this pretty much sums up the Arthashastra. It says, when anybody says it's not the money but the principle, they actually mean that it's the money. So, thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. And I don't know how we are doing for time, but I'll be happy to take some questions.
We can take a couple of questions, maybe one or two. Do we have any questions from the audience? Would you like to ask one?
Sure.
All right, there's one gentleman there, right?
There's one in front and there's one at the back.
Okay, there's one. You could just come here, right in the front. Yeah.
Did he say anything about the smart city?
So, well, obviously at that point of time in the 300 BC era which we are talking about, probably the definition of a smart city would have been very different. What Chanakya was concerned with was really how do we make these cities function better. So for example, I mean, he not only talks about what should be the width of a road, but he also talks about what should be the slope in order to make sure that the water drains properly. Similarly, for example, Chanakya talks about what is the ideal width so that during times of battle, it is possible for one chariot to overtake another chariot on that given road. When he's talking about building a treasury, he talks about what should be the depth in order to prevent the looters from being able to get to the wealth that is stored in the king's treasury. So there's a lot of input from Chanakya in terms of making a city effective, in terms of making it function efficiently. But obviously his definition of smart would be very different to our definition of smart. Sorry.
What has changed in the last 2,300 years? In fact, most states today run their economy on the revenues that they earn from liquor, lottery, the sin economy.
Absolutely.
And all the statutes that govern these businesses today are exactly the same that was talked about 2,300 years. So where are we moving? There's nothing, there's no change.
Well, to a certain extent, I must tell you, this was my worry when I was coming here. Because I was told, revisit conventional business wisdom with Chanakya. But the truth is that our conventional business wisdom actually comes from Chanakya to a certain extent. The stuff that he tells us about is stuff that we are all familiar with. It's stuff that we have experienced in some way in the business world. But what I see as a remarkable change between then and now, and unfortunately it's not for the better, the remarkable change is that Chanakya seemed to have envisaged almost every possibility where, things that could possibly go wrong. And he had worked around it in order to actually, provide a buffer, to provide a halt, to provide a break. I find that at times he is thinking 10 steps ahead. It's almost like a game of chess where he's thinking 10 moves ahead in terms of how, for example, I was very, very surprised to find that, for example, in something like foreign policy, which doesn't account for more than about 10% of the Arthashastra, but the wealth of information that Chanakya provides in terms of whether you should go into battle. He even talks about how a weak king can become strong. So in other words, what should you do? So for example, he tells a weak king that, listen, first sue for peace. But remember one thing, that when you sue for peace, then that's a temporary arrangement. In your mind, it's a temporary arrangement. And then while everyone else around you is comfortable, that's the time you start preparations for war. And you start building up your allies. You start building up your network. And he gives that in excruciating detail over some 20-odd pages. So, to my mind, this is a person who was way, way ahead of his times. I wish that we had people who could at least think in terms of using some of the strategic input that Chanakya gave in those days, even today. That is the fundamental difference between then and now. We are doing a lot of stuff, but we are doing it a little half-heartedly.
All right. Just to connect to last evening, Ashwin, it's interesting that the chairman of State Bank of India, she spoke about the power of setting a strong vision.
Yes.
And when I heard, your speech and your session, it just reminds me of the Arthashastra actually epitomizing that. Chanakya
absolutely.
in that era.
Absolutely.
But I only wonder if Chanakya was born in this era, oh my God, what would he be doing? Would just be rather pulling that remaining hair. That's on a lighter note, but Ashwin, yes, please.
Chanakya would certainly do one more thing,
What
which
would
is
he be
if he had tied up his shikha by the time that he went and acquired Magad, he would probably untie it once again by the time he was back in modern day India.
Absolutely. Well, on that lighter note, what a fascinating, revelation of the Arthashastra. A big round of applause for Ashwin. Thank you so much. I would like to invite Mr. Manoj Sharma, who's the Group Biz Head of India Today, to kindly come on the stage and give a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. My God, that's a huge value. Thank you.